Welcome, everybody. Please find your seats. And just a reminder also to please silence all cell phones. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us tonight here at Temple Beth Sholom for this special presentation. I'm Rabbi Kara Weinstein-Rosenthal, one of the rabbis here at TBS, and I'm so happy to see this crowd here in our sanctuary for this important event, and we wish to acknowledge those who are joining us on the live stream as well. Over the past 5 weeks, we have seen the terrible events of the war in Israel unfold, and those of us right here back home in Long Island have seen how the repercussions of these events have affected us in our local communities as well. One unexpected flashpoint of the Israeli-Palestinian tensions that have been bubbling over right here in our own home has been the issue of the hostages and how information about the hostages has been handled, namely posters of the hostages that have been ripped down in public spaces, which, if you're like me, you have found that extremely painful to see pictures and video footage of that. So I'm a rabbi, so I'm going to put a little bit of a spin on what the hostage posters are all about. Maybe we'll call it a midrash rather than a spin. But I'm going to say that those posters are a kind of text, even though they only have perhaps a little bit of wording on them. They do have text accompanied by pictures of our beloved Israeli brothers and sisters who have been taken hostage. And when people rip down those posters, that is an act of silencing Jewish voices and, in effect, banning a Jewish text, if you could put it that way. And I think seeing that action happening right here today in 2023 in our own community has made many people, like me, cognizant of the ways in which our long history as a people with having our works banned at various times and places and having our voices silenced, that long history continues until and encompasses what's going on with us today. Because the idea of having our voices silenced and having our texts attempt to be eradicated is something that is not new to us, but of course, it's still happening. And we planned this event all about book banning and its connection to the Jewish people and anti-Semitism well before the war in Israel broke out. But I think the events that we're seeing today, like taking down of posters, reminds us how these topics are important and relevant to us, not just because of what's happening in the larger culture, in local politics and national politics, where we talk about book bans of texts like the Diary of Anne Frank and Maus, things that affect us as Jews. But it even has to do with sometimes the shortest and most poignant of texts that we try to put out into the world, like the posters of our hostages. And when Jewish voices are silenced, it affects us and it affects our entire community. We're so glad that Dr. David Kraemer is here to talk to us about this important issue tonight, and we want to just remind you that this is one of 2 events that are going to focus on the topic of freedom of speech and the Jewish community and book bans. The conversation begins tonight, and it's going to continue 2 weeks from tonight on Monday, November 27th, where we're going to be welcoming Susan Gotterer, who's the Nassau director of the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, and she's going to be discussing the trend of book banning and move beyond the history to the issue of what we can do about this trend today. So we are so glad that you're joining us for the beginning of this conversation tonight. We hope you'll join us for the second session in 2 weeks as well, as we seek to learn about this issue and discover how we can be advocates for literature, for free speech, and for the free exchange of ideas that benefits not only our Jewish community, but all communities. I'd like to introduce Sharon Solomon, somebody who really needs no introduction. She is our TBS Director of Education, Community Engagement, and Development.
Thank you, Rabbi Rosenthal. So I want to take the opportunity to just bring to light that this program is brought to us by our Social Action Committee, who's run by many, first of all, chaired by Wendy Yeager-Hyman and her committee. And a lot of the stuff that we do is to educate and to inform. And we would like you to be involved in as many programs as possible. I also want to thank Pearl and Nathan Halegua, who bring this particular program. If it wasn't for them, this program would not be brought to light. So I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Kraemer, who comes to us. He is a professor of Talmud of Rabbinics, and he's also the librarian at the Jewish Theological Seminary. As the director of the library, Dr. Kraemer oversees the most extensive and collective of Judaica, rare and contemporary in the Western Hemisphere. Dr. Kraemer's books include The Mind of Talmud, Response to Suffering in Classical Rabbinic Literature, Reading the Rabbis, just to name a few. He's the editor of The Jewish Family, The Metaphor of Memory, and also the author of the Haggadah of the iPad published by the Melcher Media. So without further ado, it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Kraemer.
Thank you so much. You can hear me fine? Okay, great. It's really a pleasure to be here. I've been here many times before, teaching in adult ed programs and the like, and it's nice to feel the freedom, believe it or not, in terms of in-person events, the pandemic has persisted in certain ways. There aren't as many as there used to be. So it's great to be here with you in person and have an opportunity to see you face to face. I know that there will be people who will be watching this afterward in its recorded version, but I just want to say this is great. So, no, it really is. It makes a big difference. It really does make a big difference. I want to say two things. First of all, I'll do this backward. To begin with my bio, I bring two expertises to this, both of which are very relevant to a Jewish discussion of book banning. One is the fact that I'm director of the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is, in certain respects, the greatest collection of rare Judaica in the entire world. I know that sounds like this immense claim, but it's actually a claim that I could defend very, very easily. There is not a single collection anywhere in the world that rivals ours in terms of the depth and breadth of the rare materials that we possess. It's really quite extraordinary, and that's important for this discussion because if you're talking about banning books, you have to look for the evidence for it, and we've got the evidence in our collection, and you will see some images of that as we go forward, okay? So I'll show you how we learn some of the things that I will be commenting upon. The other thing is that I am a professor at JTS with my field of specialty being Talmud and Rabbinics, though I've taught all kinds of things. And the Talmud, in the context of a Jewish discussion of book banning, has a very special place. It's a notorious place from certain perspectives, but the Talmud, more than any other Jewish work, and I think I can say that without fear of being contradicted in it. I'm trying to think really quickly. Is there anything else? Yeah, I think it's true. No, it is true. That the Talmud is actually the Jewish work that has been banned more often than any other Jewish work, and for a reason which I will share with you. Let me begin actually outside of the context of what I'm going to develop simply by saying that the subject of book banning, information control, and Rabbi, I love the way you began by drawing attention to the posters because information is powerful, right? Perspective is powerful, and that's what we have in printed materials, whether it's printed flyers that you put up on, on utility poles or on walls or on doors to a church in early 16th century Germany that created a world revolution, bringing down the Catholic Church in terms of its full power and began in Protestantism. That began, right, with Martin Luther, whatever else we think about him. Yes, he was an anti-Semite, right, but he understood the power of print, and he took advantage of it. And so the very phenomenon that you're describing, I can tell you that walking around Columbia University, JTS is just up the street from Columbia, there's a very interesting battle going on for control of the narrative. You've got hostage posters, and you've got people who have ripped down hostage posters, and you've got posters with photos and identifications of Palestinian children who have lost their lives in the war, right? That is a battle over narrative, a battle over whose information will influence more people. And that is why books and print are so important, and it's what we've got to discuss in order to make sense of all this. I just wanted to tell you about, I'm going to pass the book around. I want it back at the end, so if anyone sitting back there sees someone trying to sneak out with it, please stop them. This one is just a show and tell. I was in Oaxaca, Mexico, and there was a bookstore, the majority of the works in that bookstore being obviously in Spanish, and I'm looking through the shelves, and I see a Spanish volume which is translated here into English, A Universal History of the Destruction of Books, from ancient Sumeria to modern Iraq. Every culture, every civilization has fought over books, over written or printed materials. This book, winds up being boring in the end because it's the same story over and over and over again. But the fact that we can, the fact that we must write such a history tells us something important. There is, when we're talking about the banning of books, that's about the destruction of books. When we're talking about the banning of books, there is a scholar who really created the field of the discussion of banning of books. This book that I hold in my hand is probably his most well-known. His name is Robert Darnton, very, very distinguished figure. And this book is called The Forbidden Bestsellers of Pre-Revolutionary France. Okay, so you would say, like, do we really care about the forbidden bestsellers of pre-revolutionary France? Well, you might not think you care about it, but when you open up to the chapter called Philosophical Pornography, right, and realize that this is one of the central targets of book banning in pre-revolutionary France, you begin to see that there are patterns that we will see over and over again. I'm going to pass this around. I don't know, where are the students? Back there? Okay, so parents of the students, you'll have to decide whether your young person has a chance to look at the illustrations here, but I recommend the illustrations. So, though what I just said sounded a little bit light, I intended very seriously, and I'd like to go back to the very beginning, and I am going to make this not an easy approach, but something that will challenge you from multiple perspectives. Because while it is true that Jewish books have been banned or destroyed again and again over the course of our history, it is also true that Jews have banned books over the course of our history because we, like others, have wanted to control the narrative. And the way you do that is by trying to control information. So let's start at the beginning, and I'm going to look with you at a couple of Talmudic texts. You can see the first one on the screen here. You can see that it comes from M. Sanhedrin, the Mishnah, from about the year 200, Mishnah Sanhedrin 10:1. It says, all the Jewish people have a share in the world to come, as it is stated, and it quotes a very nice verse proving that we all have a place in the world to come. But then the rabbis go on immediately and say, well, not quite, right? And these have no share in the world to come. One who says there's no resurrection of the dead from the Torah, and one who says the Torah did not originate in heaven, and an Apikoros, and then along comes Rabbi Akiva, right, a rabbi you all know, and says, also one who reads external literature. Right? You're not allowed to read outside books, says Rabbi Akiva. And this then gets expanded. So in the Talmud, they comment on Rabbi Akiva's statement, also one who reads external literature, and the comment goes on, the sages say, this is a reference to reading books of heretics. Okay? People on the outside who teach views. Heretics here might mean Christians. It might mean other kinds of sectarians. But one way or the other, it means, obviously, people of whom the rabbis don't approve. Goes on, Rabbi Yosef says it is also prohibited to read the book of Ben Sira. Ben Sira is a perfectly orthodox work of ancient Jewish wisdom. It was written by a Jewish sage who lived in Jerusalem about 150-ish BCE, actually a little bit earlier than that, 175 BCE. And his work includes all kinds of beautiful teachings, some of which are actually quoted in the Talmud, and yet they want to prohibit it because it hasn't been accepted into part of the canon. Now, what's the consequence of this? So Ben Sira is an example, but the consequence is far larger. Once upon a time, it was believed that when we look at the history of Jewish literature, we've got the library we call the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, which is the Torah, and then the historical books and the prophets, and the writings, which include works like Psalms and the like. So we've got that. And then we jump from there to rabbinic works, the Mishnah, the Midrash, the Talmud, all of those things. And if you are a traditional Jew growing up in a traditional setting, you will not know that anything came between the Hebrew Bible and the rabbinic literature, despite the fact that the period between the Hebrew Bible and rabbinic literature was the most productive period in all of Jewish history until modernity for the production of Jewish writings. Now, how is it that Jews didn't know about this? The answer is because what we see taught here, right, in the name of the rabbis, actually succeeded. The rabbis were the winners of this game, right? They were the ones who actually provided a direction for the Jewish future. And as a consequence of that, what they wanted excluded, in fact, was excluded. And many of these works, ironically, ancient Jewish works, we know only because they were preserved in one church or another, right? So the works known as the Apocrypha, right, are part of the canon of the Catholic Church. Those are all Jewish writings, the Apocrypha. It's just that they weren't preserved within the context of Judaism. One of the ironies of what I just said is that the rabbis, on the one hand, were amongst the most powerful Jewish book banners who ever existed. At the same time, and this comes also, Rabbi, back to what you said in terms of free exchange of ideas, they created a work like the Talmud, which is the most open, the most diverse, the most astoundingly, how do I say it? I mean, you can argue anything in the Talmud. You can argue almost any position at all. So what's the difference between outside and inside? This won't surprise anybody. Outside is outside. It's them, and inside is a discussion amongst us, right? So this is a foundation which, as you will see, helps us to appreciate not only that Jewish books were banned, but that we understood the power of written things, and we therefore fought the same battle. We were engaged in that battle. Now, in the ancient world, there were two kinds of ways of recording information. And by ancient here, I actually mean ancient and not so ancient. I'll give you the transition point in a moment. There were two ways of preserving things. You could write them by hand, which took a long time, was very painstaking, and if you wrote something by hand, you got only one copy. Unlike when print comes along, and that's the transition, and when print, right, movable type print comes along, all of a sudden you can print hundreds of books at one time, and books become available. But before print, how many people had how many books? Right? How many people had how many books? The answer is very few people had more than a couple of books. because books were rare and books were expensive. So that's manuscripts. The other way that information was preserved and conveyed was orally. There were oral traditions, and the rabbi's tradition for a long time was an oral tradition. But think about it. If there are few copies of something and very few people can read them, do the authorities have any interest in banning them? Is there anything to ban? Well, there is, but not much. And if you're talking about an oral literature, there's literally nothing to ban, right? So if we go back to the world before the invention of print, there was almost no censorship and almost no book banning. You've got attempts, like we see here in the teaching we just saw, to say, don't read that, don't listen to that, right? But it's not a concern. The church, for example, didn't actually censor books until books began to be printed. And I'll come back to that in a moment. I do have to say here that book burning is different than book banning. Okay? Burning is different than banning, and crucially, burning and banning is different than censorship. Okay? So think about censorship. What does censorship mean? Censorship doesn't mean to exclude an entire book. Expurgation is not excluding an entire play. What does censorship mean? Finding a section that's objectionable and getting rid of that section. And it might be very, very small. Right? That is typically what censorship is, and I'll have more to say that in a moment. What we do see before the world of print is actually burning, destruction in a violent way. So, coming to the Talmud, which was a very special case, was burned in Paris, was one of the first major burnings of the Talmud in 1242. It was burned in Rome in 1553, very, very famously, burnings of the Talmud. Right? They were very notable events. But when you burn a gathering of books, that's different than censoring it. What is the meaning of burning as opposed to censoring? Censoring says, I've got a section here that I object to. Burning says, this book symbolizes something that I hate. Right? Burning says, this book symbolizes something that I hate. So why was the Talmud so hated? Very, very simple. Because, and it was hated in the Christian world. Why was the Talmud hated? Because Christians and we obviously share the tradition of what they called the Old Testament, and we call the Tanakh. Right? That is part of, that is the Jewish Bible, and that is part of the Christian Bible. So Christians can't actually say that's a problematic tradition. Their claim is that's our tradition. Right? Where did Jews go wrong? Where did Jews and Christians separate? In the rabbinic world. After the Hebrew Bible, after the Tanakh, when Jews stubbornly didn't understand the truth of Jesus, the truth represented in what Christians call the New Testament, and instead of following the New Testament, what did Jews stubbornly, declare their allegiance to? The rabbis and the Talmud. And so the Talmud represented the stubbornness of Jews for refusing to go along with the Christian message, and therefore you burn it, not because you want to get rid of every word in it because the words themselves are problematic, but because it represents a direction that Jews went that is opposed to the Christian vision of the world. That was the problem with Talmud, and it was burned symbolically to purify the world of its insidious symbolism. Right? That was all before print. What happens when print comes along? I'm going to show you a couple of examples of this. I think we can actually skip that. When print comes along, and you'll see pictures in a moment, but this is a representative text to show you that what we're going to see in the pictures didn't come from the Jewish side, didn't come from the Christian side alone. Christians were very prominent in censoring Jewish works, but Jews also recognized the power and therefore the danger of information. Right? So you can see here, there's a discussion from the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch is a great work of Jewish law that came to expression in the middle part of the 16th century, which is precisely the time that books that were printed are spreading very, very quickly. It is the new age of print. And you can see, so, the Rashba permits handling of an astrolabe. Interesting, right? The question of, are you allowed to use scientific instruments, right? So he permits a handling on Shabbat if you want to, as well as books of wisdom, right? But it is questionable whether it is permissible according to Rambam, according to Maimonides. So here we've got a difference of opinion, but you can see Maimonides' inclination, right, is to say that no, outside books remain prohibited, and this became more and more a concern. So there's another section of the Shulchan Aruch, of the Code of Jewish Law, which I don't give you here, but there was, for those of you, I don't know, whoever has the Book of Banned Books now, right? It's going around somewhere, right? So that philosophical pornography, there was a Jew who lived in Rome in about the year 1300 who also wrote a book of philosophical pornography. It happened to be in poetic form, most of it, and you know our prayer, Yigdal, right? Yigdal comes from this philosophical pornography, right? Because the philosopher, what he does is he writes theology in poetic form, and then he's in between, the philosophy, in between the theology, he tries to seduce a woman, the author tries to seduce a woman he's very much in love with by sharing his philosophical wisdom and then describing what he'd like to do with her. Okay? Parts of it are, shall we say, rather explicit, written by, as I said, a Roman Jew in 1300. For reasons that will surprise no one, this became a very popular work. It was one of the very, very first Jewish books printed when the printing press was invented, and along comes the Shulchan Aruch and says, you're not allowed to read it. Why not? For the same reason that Robert Darnton, right, reports that the French authorities forbade the same kind of work in the 18th century, for exactly the same kind of reason. So not only did the Christian authorities need to approve, but Jewish authorities wanted to be part of this discussion as well. And what did it look like? Now we're going to Christian censorship. This is a printed work from the library of JTS. This was printed in 1491. The text you see on the top right is from the book of Psalms, and what you see surrounding it is a commentary by a very well-known rabbi who goes by the name Radak, at least we know of him as the Radak, and in his commentary, he argues against Christian interpretations of certain psalms, right? Christian tradition looked at certain psalms and said, look, that predicts Jesus. That predicts Jesus, and Radak thought that was ridiculous. So he wrote that down. When he wrote it before the printing press, nobody had any concern for it. If the church knew about it, they didn't bother with it because how many people would read it? But when this was printed in hundreds of copies, right, the church had to begin to worry. Now, 1491, as I said, you can see it wasn't originally censored. Someone came along and censored it later, and we see his signature here. This is on the last page of the book, and if you look carefully, you can see, the first of the two written lines beneath the end of the printed text. See the year there, 1584? You see that? 1584? That's what happened. At first, authorities, whether it was the church or whether it was the rabbis, didn't realize what the danger of this new form would be, of the printed work. And so things just were printed the way they had been written in manuscripts. But all of a sudden, in the middle 1500s, the church realizes we've got to control information, right? Otherwise, we're in a lot of trouble. Part of what motivated that, frankly, was the Protestant Revolution that originated up in Germany. The church was challenged. And so they created long lists of books that couldn't be printed, and ironically, of other books that could be printed only if they were censored. So if you were to get a copy of this from the year 1550, say, onward, the section that we saw before that has been, blacked out, that's been censored, wouldn't be there at all. It would just be absent from the page, right? Because everyone knew you couldn't print it that way. But books printed earlier, or books written earlier. This is a beautiful manuscript that we've got in our collection. Can anyone see what the prayer there is? Anyone see what the prayer is? Look in the middle of the page on the right, right in the red. What is it? Aleinu. That's the Aleinu prayer. What's the problem with Aleinu prayer? Well, you probably don't know, because in your prayer book, the problematic sections don't appear. Because from the time they were censored in the mid-1500s and onward, they were never printed again until modern Israel. Okay? And what it says in the Aleinu prayer is, they pray to foolishness and nothingness, and we pray to the true God. Now, what do you think the church thought about that? Not so much, right? Meaning they thought a lot, but they didn't feel very good about it. And so the censorship you see here, and you can see this one, I'm sorry about the unclear picture, but this one actually is from 1611. You might be able to make it out there. The point is, and this is crucial, that information is powerful, and because it's powerful, it's dangerous. And it's not just Jewish information that's powerful and dangerous, it's all information that's powerful and dangerous. And so these Jewish works, which we see censored, right, were part of long lists that included Christian writings as well, because Christians wrote things that the church objected to. There's nothing unique about censorship of Jewish works. All works were censored, right? And that's part of what we see in the phenomenon here. Now, of course, censorship has an ironic consequence, right? In the year, I gave you the years before, so the first one was 1242, the Talmud was burned. Beginning in the 1550s, the Talmud was censored. What's the difference between burning and censorship? Burning gets rid of it. It doesn't exist anymore. But if you censor it, what are you doing? You're getting rid of the few problematic passages, but ironically, you're also saying the rest is just fine. And the consequence of the regime of church censorship was to say that about a dozen sections that are anti-Christian in the Talmud, you can't print anymore. But the rest of the Talmud, its 20 massive volumes, the church approves of. Now, isn't that ironic, right? The church approves of the vast majority of the Talmud. That was the consequence, right, of what was going on here. It's all a battle over details. Now, I could go through some of the middle history here, but I want to go to more recent and to the modern because, of course, printing became much easier, technologically far quicker, far more people knew how to read because there were more books around, so more books were published, right? All of this in a very favorable cycle, and with more books around, of course, there were more problems, right? Because authorities saw things and they said, we don't like that very much. So, Rabbi, before you mentioned a few Jewish works that for various reasons have been banned, right? The irony is that when they're banned in one place, people elsewhere, of course, say, oh, that must be a really interesting book, right? And so they go out of their way to buy. What happened in France before the revolution is you couldn't print those works in France, so there was the way we know about this is there was a publisher over the border in Switzerland who published all the things that the French said you couldn't print. Right? That's what happens when you say you can't read something. Think about the books the lists that librarians have created of banned books and the organizations that have created online platforms. If you want to read a banned book, you can find them all for free online. Did you know that? Right? Ironically, I tried this the other day. I was trying to get a banned book, and what's interesting is they only provide them for free to people who live in areas where the books are banned. Okay, so it's actually a library platform, a national library platform, where if you live in certain counties in Texas or in Iowa or places like that where the book is banned, you can get it for free. If you live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, I made the mistake of putting in my zip code. I couldn't get it for free because I can go get the book at the bookstore. But that's the dynamic of it. But of course, the last chapter of this, I mean, there's never a last chapter, but the last historical chapter of this looks like this. Right? Now, this is a painting. I'll say a word about it in a moment. Here we've got a representation, at least, of Nazi book burning. Right? It's not a literal picture. You know what those look like. Right? But here's another one from the same Haggadah. So this is, David Wander is an artist, a living, contemporary Jewish artist. Years ago, he created a Haggadah in memory of the Holocaust. It's really a magnificent work. And he decided not to represent any human figures in it, even though he knew that, Jewish artists through the ages actually, despite the commandment in the Ten Commandments, have provided representations of human figures. He wanted to follow the commandment that forbade it. So instead of giving an illustration of the four sons, which is what you see in front of you here, he let books represent the four sons. Right? So you can see, right, the one that's closed is the one who doesn't know how to ask. The one that's open but with no text on it is the simple son. The wise son, obviously, is the text, where you've got the text and the book open. And of course, right, given what I just said, obviously the burning pages are the wicked son, the Rasha, right? Because burning books is wickedness. Right? And he represents that again here. And this he imagines as what happened to Jews at their Seder tables when they opened their doors for Elijah. When they opened their doors for Elijah. And of course, again, not representing people, he represents books. And so books are thrown over and books are burned. Now, one of the ironies of Nazi book burning is the following. Of course, books were burned regularly under the Nazi regime, and we've got many, many photos of them. They were burned not because the information in them was problematic. Why were they burned? Going back to what I said before, right? Because they were Jewish. They symbolized Jew. And in the Nazi regime, that was reason to wipe them out. But once you're finished with this symbolic act, there's still a lot of books left. Right? And so, ironically, what the Nazis did is they collected libraries, thousands and thousands and thousands of Jewish books, and they put them into storage places, right? Depots, into warehouses. And when the war was over, these hundreds of thousands of books were discovered by troops who were retaking the territories throughout Europe, and those books were sent to Jewish libraries in successor communities that didn't own those books. Okay, so at the JTS library, we actually got fewer than other libraries did because we already had a lot of the books, right? But we did get some. We've got hundreds. Right, I don't think it was more than 1,000. We don't have an exact number. But the Yeshiva University Library got many books. The National Library of Israel got many books. So imagine this, right? The act of gathering so that those books would not be available, they were banned, wound up enriching the resources and therefore the wisdom and knowledge of Jewish libraries and therefore Jews from all around the world. Right? That is the ironic consequence of the destruction that was not a destruction. So let me step back for a moment and just offer my own thought about what all of this means, and then I welcome whatever questions you have. Information, as I began, is powerful. Right? And every authority wants to control the narrative. They want to control what information you have access to and what information you don't have access to. The rabbis or Jews, right, went a direction that I'm uncomfortable with, banning certain things, and a direction that I'm very comfortable with, which is admitting a variety of opinions in debate that is as wide as any you can imagine. Not a catechism, right, a very specific list of things that you should believe, right, but a debate and then another debate and another debate. That is why I have my love for the Talmudic tradition, which I think is at the foundation of everything that Jews prize in terms of information and debate and argument. We are an argumentative people, and that's a good thing, right? So we've been on the good side and the bad side. We've suffered from those who wanted to control the narrative and take us out of the narrative. But we have also ironically benefited sometimes to very, very wicked, right? I mean, the Nazi regime, that was the ironic consequence. But it also needs to be said that Jewish books were created, were printed most abundantly in the places where Jewish life was the best through the ages. If you look for a golden age, you will find Jews there. And if you find a golden age with Jews, and Jews in Europe at least were present for almost all of the local golden ages, you will find that that was a center of the print of Jewish books. So it could be in Italy during the Renaissance before the Inquisition came and freaked out over Protestant reform. You will find it in Amsterdam, which became in the 17th century, 1600s, a major, wonderful home, both for Ashkenazi Jews and for Sephardi Jews who had fled from the Iberian Peninsula, and a very rich center of the printing of Jewish books. Or then we go to Central Europe, right? In later centuries, Poland was one of the greatest places for the production of Jewish books during the Polish Golden Age, right? So we're talking again 17th, 18th century when Jewish life there flourished. And wherever books are and Jews are, that's where civilization, where culture will flourish. So I would just warn those, right, who oppose this kind of, the kind of sharing of information, the printing and the reading of books that might challenge us, right? If you try to ban it, right, your culture will be worse. It will not be golden, it will be cheapened, right? And you will suffer as a result. Jews, right, we will find ourselves the next golden age, right? I'm confident about that. But if you try to ban us, right, we'll find another place to produce, to share our ideas, and to engage in a new creativity. That, I believe, is something Jews have always done and will always do. So I welcome your questions. Did someone collect? You got them. Okay. Okay. Are we afraid of someone speaking up? No. Why, okay, if someone wants to start with a vocalized question, that would be fine, or comment. Anybody? Yes. 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 That's a good question. It's just, so the question is, in the Ashrei, the nun line is missing, right? Was it banned? The answer is not as far as we can tell, or the alternative answer is yes, it was banned, but it was banned by God, right? Who was believed, of course, to be the source of the revelation of the Spirit that created sacred scripture, including the Psalms, including, therefore, Ashrei. In the rabbinic fanciful explanation, the reason that nun was left out is because it connects to the word nofel, which means fall, right? We don't want Israel to fall, right? Israel the people. I'm not talking about current events. Israel the people to fall. And what happened, according to the rabbinic explanation, is it got embedded in the next line where it says, Somech l'chol hanoflim, that God supports all those who have fallen. So if it was banned, God was the banner in that case. Yes? They did. I didn't mention that just because I didn't know if you knew about it, but yes, they did find in the Dead Sea Scrolls a version with a nun in it, but there is a rule in scholarship which has almost no exceptions. There are occasionally exceptions, but the rule is that if you see a text with no problems and a text with problems, the problematic text is probably the original one, and the non-problematic text, someone fixed. So in the case of the Dead Sea Psalm, which replaces that, in all likelihood what happened is that someone was bothered by the absence of a nun line and they invented it. But it's actually not a very good line. Okay, yes?
Okay, I think you alluded to this in your last comment before we started with questions, but somebody is asking if you can comment on the effect, or what about banning in libraries today? What about states that are particularly banning books in the library?
I mean, it's an extension of what I said, and I'm happy, to repeat it in slightly different words. What you read, what you allow to be read, what you create as information is about controlling the narrative. It's about identity, right? So in places where they think, wrongly I should add, right, where they think that they can control the ultimate identity of their young people or others by, taking these books out of the libraries, that's what they're fighting for. I understand why they're doing it. They're going to fail, right? But, there is a long human history of trying to do that. And so, to come, and I think the posters represent this very, very well. It is worth, right, looking for current Israel news in multiple publications with different ideological inclinations, orientations. It's worth it just to see the way the battle over information is developing, okay? So, I personally regularly read, literally every day, Yediot Achronot, right, which is one particular political orientation in Israel. I read Haaretz, which is a very different, more left orientation. And I read Al Jazeera, right? All of them on the apps on my phone, because I want to know, what the various parties are saying and how they're trying to, spin, right? Control the narrative. That is what we do with information. It's worth, by the way, I do recommend this because you'll be upset, right? But it's worth being upset because you'll have a better understanding of, kind of where the world is going. Okay, what else?
I just want to comment my own reaction to what you just said. and I'm
Please.
gonna go off to you because I can't read that stuff. A friend of mine sent me an article, a blurb or something that I can't even repeat the title. It was so offensive, and I wrote back to her and said, I will not open that. We can still be friends if you want, but I can't read it.
Okay. I understand the sensitivities today, I really do, and I know why someone might be, feeling the way you do, but ultimately, we're going to have to be, I believe, more aware of, those various opinions, because if you're going to fight something, you got to know what it is. Yes? Book banning in the Muslim world. The history of books in the Muslim world is actually very different because the printing press, which really was instrumental in this history, did not come to the Muslim world until much later than European nations. And the earliest printing presses in the Muslim world were actually brought by Sephardi Jews, right, who upon leaving Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, brought them to Turkey and so forth. Without printed books, as I said earlier, there's not a lot to worry about because not a lot of people are going to see it. And so the experienced danger of problematic books isn't going to be seen there. It's in the 20th century, literally in the 20th century, that book banning comes to be more common in Muslim lands under, modern Muslim regimes, but not before that. Anybody else? Yes?
You said that it doesn't work. Book banning doesn't work.
Right, it never works.
Could you just, I guess I don't see that. What do you mean?
Banned books are, first of all, they always are preserved, always, right? And beyond that, by becoming notorious to one party, they become of greater interest to another party, always, right? So if you ban a book in Iowa, right? Someone is going to create an online site that provides you, as I said, but right, with access to these books for free. And particularly in a world where, our technology enables us to do that with such facility, but even in worlds of the past, you can try to wipe out the Talmud, right? So, for example, Venice was the most significant center for the printing of books, all books, Christian, Jewish, otherwise, from the late 15th century, late 1400s, through the first half of the 1500s, of the 16th century. Only then did the church realize the danger and get the regime of censorship going. So in 1550-ish, the Talmud, 1552 I think it was, the Talmud was forbidden to be reprinted in Venice, even though the earliest printings of the Talmud, very famously beautiful editions, were by the Bomberg House in Venice. So what did they do? They went to other smaller northern Italian cities, right? And having been banned in Venice, and they printed them there. And when they were then banned there, they just moved north and they printed them elsewhere. You can't control this.
How about, like, in a school where books were banned, that only this?
And do we think the students who don't have access to it in their library anymore aren't going to find it elsewhere if they want to find it? Of course they'll find it. We know what else they're finding, right? Right? Which might be more problematic, but okay, Okay, I mean, that's the way information flows. Information is like water, not just in our age with its technologies, which makes it so easy to flow, but in prior ages too. Information finds the cracks. It goes to the other side of the wall, and once it's through the cracks, it will always be available. Anything else? Yes?
What about the fact that in so many cultures there's a movement to kill the author of books that people don't like?
Well, when that happens, so let's specify. Do you have someone in particular in mind? Yes, and do you have an author in mind? Yeah, Salman Rushdie, right? Yes, that is a real phenomenon too. When someone is understood by an extremist monotheism, I'm choosing my words very carefully here and I'll be happy to explain them, but when someone is identified by an extremist monotheism to be a heretic, right, as Rushdie has been, then that extremist monotheism will seek to murder him. Ironically, his books will survive him, right, and people will read them generation after generation. Coming back to the earlier observation, you can kill the author. You can do that, but you can't kill the book. Now, the reason I talk about an extremist monotheism here is because it's only people who believe that they've got the single truth, right, and believe it deeply and fervently, who will, take a heretic and say, of course I should wipe them out because they'll lead others astray, and besides, they don't have a place in paradise anyhow, so why not just kill them, right? But it's not just extremist Islam that does that, though extremist Islam does, right? But extremist fundamentalist Christianity has done that plenty. And we've had less power than Islam and Christianity, so we haven't done it as often, but, that's because of a different history. Yes?
I just wanted to mention at the same token, Mein Kampf became very popular in the Arab world.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, listen, once you can print, once you can spread information, right, and you can, the most awful information will spread too. Right, and just to put this actually together, what would be these two parts of the conversation, which is why I think wisdom, right, if we were truly wise about these things, we wouldn't seek to ban them, right, because they're going to get through anyhow. What we would do is we would seek to teach against them, right? We would seek to educate people so they understood, right, how awful, how incorrect, how distorted, how hateful certain things are, right? Can't wipe out the book, but you can create wisdom and understanding that will help people appreciate that the book is not to be taken seriously. Yes?
You mentioned before that you are capable of reading the vile histories, the way that they portray the Jewish people, that they portray Israel, and you're actually capable of reading it or seeing reading Al Jazeera, and I would say that this moment over here, that most of us are just so frightened of it and so we don't want to know their truth. We don't want it to weaken, I think, in some sense, our core belief in both our goodness, our rights to our story, our rights to believe our story, and I think we're very afraid to know what they say also. So how do you do it without weakening yourself?
Well, I've got a very strong core Jewish identity. is the beginning of the answer. It doesn't challenge or weaken that identity at all. So, you know, I mean, to begin with, by personality, I'm not a fearful person, but I have a very strong core Jewish identity. So when I read it, it's not a challenge on that level. The reason I think it's so important is because, I mean, first of all, let's understand, Al Jazeera, right, is not a, you know, in the context of the Muslim Arab world, is not an extremist publication, right? It has a lot of things that we might object to, but it actually reports things that might surprise you, or reports things in ways that might surprise you. But let me, I'll give you a very specific example. Last week, or maybe it was the week before, I noticed a special audio story, an interview with a variety of experts, and I do put that in scare quotes, over the question, is Israel now committing a genocide? Okay? I'm just going to wait till, yeah. It's okay, it was a really nice guitar riff. Is Israel committing genocide? So, you know, I wanted to hear it because one of the battles over narrative today is ownership of the word genocide, okay? Because Israelis are using it for what Hamas did, right? And what they believe many Palestinians want, right? And, right, the Palestinian side and Arabs, right, who identify with that side, are using it for what Israel is doing, right? So I saw that and I was curious. And what I heard at the beginning, I didn't listen to it through because I could fill in most of it, but what I heard at the beginning was something that shook me. And I learned something from it. So what it was reference to the fact that, and this is absolutely correct, that there are many in Israel today, and this has a history, who are describing the enemy as Amalek, right? Many were describing the enemy as Amalek, and what the Torah says is that you've got to wipe out the memory of Amalek from under the heavens. Right? You've got to wipe out the memory of Amalek. And that was quoted correctly because, right, it is being used constantly in Israeli settings as evidence that this is what Israel wants. Now, that unsettled me deeply, it upset me deeply, but it also helped me appreciate the power of the rhetoric on the other side, which is fighting to control the narrative. And I believe that, I mean, this is, being an expert in information, right? In the historical sense of that term. I believe that we don't stand a chance of controlling the narrative or of influencing hearts, right, to appreciate our narrative unless we are aware of the narrative that we're fighting. That is, I understand people have different opinions about that. That is my opinion. You're absolutely right that one of the reasons I can do that is because it doesn't challenge my core identity. And I think that by learning those things, I actually wind up at an advantage in being able to, if I get involved in a discussion with one of my students, for example, or if I get involved in a discussion with God knows whom, right? The friend of a student from Columbia and so forth. I can have that conversation in a way that enables them to listen to me because I know what they've been listening to. Right? Now, I don't expect everyone will be able to do that or will be, open to do it because it can be very hurtful to hear these things. But for me, it's important. That's all I can say.
I guess, I'm sorry, but where are you going to go if you don't have the answer? So let's say we say, okay, I'm going to contemplate for a moment the dead children in Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And their view that we are killing them on purpose. Now, I know what I have two minds. One is, do you remember what you did to
So that we probably shouldn't get into a lengthy conversation about this, but all I would say is don't go to Al Jazeera, go to the opinion page of Haaretz, right, where you will hear, right, that the orthodoxy that dominates today in the Jewish world has its critics. So if we're not open to the Palestinian narrative, and I certainly understand that emotionally, then maybe we should hear what some of the internal critics are saying and doing. And it's become more and more prominent. I mean, we're now 6 weeks out, right? Something like that. We're now 6 weeks out. The voices of criticism are emerging more and more powerfully in Israel today. This is not our enemies, right, who are trying to do us harm. This is people who care deeply about Israel's future. Did you see there's a video that's gone viral with 3 Israelis singing in Hebrew. You can find it with translation, I think, to the tunes of Sounds of Silence. Look for it. Okay, Sounds of Silence in Hebrew, recent production. It speaks for a powerful voice in Israel. If we don't think we need to understand the voice of the enemy, and I certainly understand that, although I feel better prepared to engage in conversation when I know it, I think we should understand, right, the voice of the variety of orientations that are being expressed in Israel, because those, after all, are our brothers and sisters. Okay. Thank you. And does somebody have my book? Thank you. Okay.
It didn't go out the back door. Okay. I'd like to thank Dr. Kraemer. I cannot begin to tell you what an eye-opening evening this has been. I'd also like to thank Rabbi Rosenthal and our wonderful cantor and resident tech expert, Cantor Barnoy. And yes, you do, but you have to know who to hire. That's knowledge too. And also our senior rabbi, Rabbi Ben Gideon, who is currently representing us in Israel. May he return safely. And I'd also like to thank all the members of our Social Action Committee for their caring and hard work. We are a committee that tries to bring programs to you that reflect society and work towards making it better. We invite you to join us and to help to work to make this a more just world for all of us. We live in an extremely unsettling time. Unfortunately, we know how Jews have so often been persecuted throughout history during authoritarian regimes. Anti-Semitism is rearing its awful head all over the world. We must fight to preserve our democracy and our freedom. When others can tell us what to read, they can also tell us what to think, and they can tell us who to hate. When that has happened in the past, the directive has often been turned to blame the Jews, hate the Jews, and destroy the Jews. As we see the rise of censorship and book banning throughout the country, we should be frightened when Brown Bear, and the Diary of Anne Frank have been taken off the shelves of libraries. We must ask ourselves what's next. Please join us on the 27th when Susan Gottheimer, the director of Nassau County, New York Civil Liberties Union, joins us to discuss the current status of book banning throughout the country and in our area. And most importantly, what can we do about it? I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank you all for caring. And I want to thank you all for helping to stem the tide. Please join us in the lobby for some refreshments. After all, it is a Jewish organization. Thank you very much.